Today's guest is the Director of Mindwise Consulting in Boulder City, Nevada. She has 30 plus years experience in the parapsychology and conscientious consciousness fields, including 5 years working at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research PEAR laboratory and 25 years in the remote viewing field as a trainer, researcher, and consultant. She's the author of 8 books, including Remote Perceptions, Seer, Tactical Remote Viewing, and Voices from the Cosmos, authored with C.B. Scott Jones, along with her new book, Scribe. She took controlled remote training in the mid-1990s with both Dr. Paul H. Smith and Lynn Buchanan, and is the founding and member and director of the International Remote Viewing Association, IRVA. Let's welcome today's guest, Angela Thompson Smith. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Adam. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, it's always a nice experience to be able to communicate and be in the company of someone like yourself who shares so many of the interests that a lot of people have, as well as myself. And we always discuss, or I discuss, people going down a certain rabbit hole of uncovering information, and the more you look, the more you'll find, right?
Right.
And maybe you could just give the audience a little bit of a background of how you got into this type of work itself, the remote viewing, the esoteric itself.
Yes, yeah. Well, I've always been interested in these areas. I grew up in England, as you can tell from my accent. Came over to the States in '81, and I'd always had out-of-body experiences since I was a child, and didn't really discover what they were until my early 30s, and then started researching them and finding out that there were other people who had these experiences too. And I thought when I was a child, they were very much like dreams, that everybody had them, but people didn't talk about them. Then I realized that not everybody has these experiences. So that made me curious to find out what they were, why I had them, etc., and what I could do with them. And so in the late before I came over here to the States, so it was about 1980, I joined up with a group of people at Manchester University, and together we were doing some very private studies. It wasn't connected with the university at all, just that we all worked there. And going and they went on vacation. I would try and remote view where they were with their permission, of course. And then if I went off somewhere, they would try and remote view me. That we called it out of body at that time, remote perception. And we found that we got not everything, but enough information to show that something had picked up information about the locations. Excuse me, I got some allergies.
Yeah, I do as well, I know.
And so from there, when I came to the States, it wasn't until about the 1980s, late 80s, that I found it was a lab. It wasn't the Princeton lab at first, but there was another lab called PRL, the Psychophysical Research Laboratories at Princeton, that was also running at that time. And I volunteered there. I was working as a medical researcher in New Jersey, and decided I would like to go down and volunteer and find out what they were doing, which was the Ganzfeld research, where they put people in like a little isolation room and trying to pick up information from another location. And that was fascinating. And it was from there I went on to PEAR. So that's sort of how I got into the very basic levels of it.
Yeah, interesting. We discuss, I interview different people and we discuss the brain itself and consciousness is either being part or separate from the brain itself. And, and when we dream and when we pass on, people have near-death experiences where they receive information outside of their body.
Yeah.
How would you explain some of the concepts, the esoteric work as it relates to, out-of-body experiences and remote viewing? Are there some components that fill those voids of understanding?
I think so. I think we have to look back in history to understand it, because if you go back to our earliest ancestors, they knew how to go look for, see where the best hunting grounds were, where they could best be safe, where the caves were, where they could live, where the water was. And if we go to some of the indigenous tribes today, they have those same skills. And I think what we're using and we're calling by the modern terms, remote viewing, out of body experience, etc., we've always had these ancient skills as a human race. And it's just now that we've become so modernized that modern science, which is stemming from the behaviorist schools at the turn of the last century, which said if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist.
Right.
There's a taboo almost, there's been a taboo about understanding these topics. So it's been a bit of a fight really to get to the remote viewing accepted, etc. In the modern world. Science says, no, there's no such thing. It doesn't work. The mind doesn't work that way. The brain and the mind are one, and you can't separate them. But history tells us you can.
Yeah. It's funny. I have a lot of friends that always say, until I see it, I don't believe it. And
Right.
and it's so interesting to hold on to that anchor and be anchored into such a left brain concept of control and ego.
Yes.
What would you
Yeah.
say? What would you say would be the one quality, since we all have we possess the ability to probably remote view and to have an OBE, or relieve our consciousness, remove ourselves from a situation or remote view. What would you say would be one of the qualities that would add to this or help assist this?
I think if you meditate or you can daydream or you have very vivid dreams, I think you have the mechanisms there to do out of body work and remote viewing.
Yeah.
If you wake up some mornings or before you go to sleep and you have vivid imagery, those are good times to launch and go and see if you can remote view or see if you can go and have an out of body experience. Because Robert Monroe at the Monroe Institute studied this for many decades, and he found that those two particular times of our wake sleep cycles were very conducive to us just going and expanding our consciousness, expanding our subconscious.
You
So I
teach.
think that's.
Yeah. Yeah. You teach classes
Go ahead.
on remote viewing, and in terms of people remote viewing, there are different forms of accessing information or different ways of getting the information. Could you discuss
Yeah,
just a little
different
bit of?
people. Sure. Yeah, different people have brought in different methodologies of how to do it. And as Lynn Buchanan says, access is like a balloon. You could access it from the point where the air goes in, or you could access it from one of the sides of the balloon or the bottom of the balloon. So all these different methods enable you to access non-local consciousness, to go and look at these areas. But from our natural, I call it natural remote viewing. When Ingo Swann in the I think this was back in the 1970s, where he and Janet Mitchell began to investigate what Ingo could do naturally. And they worked at the ASPR, the American Society for Psychical Research in New York. Janet Mitchell was a researcher there, as was Carlos Osis. And they studied Ingo Swann. And he didn't call it out of body or mental travel or anything at that time. It was just a psychic ability that he could just go out of body and go locations. Now, Janet Mitchell is still here. She lives in Boulder City. And I visited her with a friend yesterday.
Oh, interesting.
She's quite elderly now, but still as sharp as ever.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Ingo Swann then took his abilities and the term remote viewing, which he termed, along with Janet Mitchell, out to Stanford Research Institute, where Puthoff and Targ were researching paranormal abilities. and spent, I think it was 9-10 years out there, developing what they eventually came to call remote viewing, and then controlled remote viewing. So that was a very specific methodology, a scientific methodology, how to go out of body. But of course, Russell Targ as well and Al Puthoff had a more natural way that they were using it as well, which was just saying to somebody, here's a random series of letters and numbers. It's the address of where you're supposed to go. Just go remote view it. So it wasn't like 9 Baker Street, but it was like GPS for the soul.
That's interesting.
They called it a coordinate. Yeah. And I like that. I coined that, GPS for the soul.
Excellent.
Yeah. So they did that for many years at SRI. And of course, then the military took it over. And then they called it, of course, controlled remote viewing as well. They adopted the controlled remote viewing. They were doing another kind of remote viewing before that, which they called extended remote viewing, which was a more natural remote viewing of somebody sitting in a chair with a monitor or somebody guiding them, like guided imagery. And they did that for many years until the group learned CRV, controlled remote viewing, from Ingo Swann.
Right.
And from there, it was like the churches breaking off from the churches. You got then scientific, because different people took the controlled remote viewing methodology and adapted it for their own use. So there was controlled remote viewing, scientific remote viewing, technical remote viewing, etc., etc. The controlled remote viewing has stayed pretty stable, and it's a very it is a very controlled methodology. But if you stick to it, if you learn it and stick to it, you will get data, because you're following through different stages. Let me look at this. Let me look at this. With more extended remote viewing or natural remote viewing, you can just, and I do that with an OBE method, is just to go to the target, get the information, bring it down, write it down. So there are many, many different methodologies, and I don't ascribe to any particular one as the best,
Right.
because you have to find the one that best suits your personality.
Are there any implications in terms of, obviously you said the government and military, did it originate in one specific country and then a country learned how to do it from them? Did it start off here in America? Did it start in Russia?
Well, Russia was also doing investigations into these areas. So they were, I think, when I looked back at some of the information, they were pretty much parallel, and they kind of fed off each other. They heard that maybe the Americans were doing something, so, oh, let's try it. And they found that, oh, look, the Russians are doing something. And that was the whole reason for the military group coming in and saying, okay, we need to study remote viewing, because the Russians already have it. They're already using this. We need to have it too.
Yeah. So interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I took the class with you, and I've interviewed before. I've interviewed before, and you've explained and you've shared some specific targets that you yourself were able to find, as well as other people specifically. Maybe you can just share some of the. What's interesting is that the remote viewing can be targeted to almost an exact point and an exact image.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it has implications to assist in so many different areas, as you have done yourself. And maybe you can just share.
Yeah, I can give you a couple. The first one was I was at one of the remote viewing conferences, the International Remote Viewing Association, which we're having again in August. It's going to be in conjunction with the Monroe Institute in Virginia. And my colleague came up and said, I have a project for you. I don't want to tell you what it is, because very often we work blind, which means we don't know anything about the target. So you don't start imagining stuff or making up stuff. And he gave me a couple of letters and numbers, an alphanumeric. And I went away and I did ERV, which was the natural remote viewing. I saw water, brackish water. There was weed that looked kind of weird, and it was near an estuary, and it was near, there was a lot of information, land, water information, and I felt that somebody had died there. So I gave him that information, and he said, no, this is about my friend. I haven't heard from him for months. He can't have died. I don't think he's died. So I think you're off. We call it off target. And I said, well, I've got a bunch of other people that do remote viewing. Would you like me to ask them or task them to do this? So it came back with a lot more information about this individual who others perceived had died as well in the water. So then he got really curious because I didn't tell the other viewers what I had perceived, but they'd gone to the location and picked up the information. This was the Denver DJ murder case that I've written up about, and Williams. And he'd actually befriended somebody who took him out on the boat and actually shot him and pushed him overboard.
Wow.
And so we did a lot more work on this. It'd take much too long to go into it, but I have written it up in some of my books. And it actually caught the attention of the LA Sheriff's Office and the people there, and they knew about remote viewing for some reason. And they actually then started looking into it, and they found out who did this. And they found out that all the information was correct. The guy went off to Montana for a while, but they picked him up, took him back to California, tried him, and convicted him. He's now in prison. So we were instrumental in helping that to come about.
Yeah, and that was interesting. Yeah. What about the space shuttle? I remember you.
Yeah, the space shuttle was interesting because I had been contacted by a colleague actually for a missing woman case, a missing girl case, but then they found her, and the person who'd put in the request was a senior manager at NASA, and I was going to say Lockheed, but this was a NASA one. And so I talked to him. I said, well, is there another project that you would like us to work on? As you found the girl, which is fantastic. We didn't help find the girl. She was found by someone else. He said, well, we're having problems with the shuttle. And he said, I don't want you to tell the viewers what this is, but see if you can find out. And he gave me a list of questions, and some of them was, if we continue using the shuttle, will there be a problem? Et cetera, et cetera. And what can we do to ameliorate these problems? And so I gave it out to a bunch of remote viewers. Some of them I had trained, some had trained with other people, but they were all reliable viewers. They came back with so much information that, and when I'd got so much information back, I then tasked them again and said, you're all correct, but this is a device. How can these problems be helped? And then they sent back a whole bunch. And one lady mentioned the shuttle. She hadn't been told, but she knew from her, they'd just been blind tasked and then tasked with the device. And so they said basically planned obsolescence was the goal. If this device was not fixed, there would be a disaster, and it would be national. And of course, the Columbia, when it re-entered, they did pull some of the shuttles offline actually for a while, but then things went back to usual. And then the shuttle exploded on re-entry, which was, I think it was on takeoff. And of course, it was devastating. I just cried when I saw that. And I thought, what do I say to this manager? You can't say, we told you, but I sent my condolences to him, and we were in touch. And he said he had tried to send that information up the line to the senior management, and they didn't want to know. They didn't want to hear it. So unfortunately, So that was a sad outcome to some of our work.
Yeah, I guess it's what's interesting is the fact that having the knowledge or pre-knowledge of something that can go bad and then not being able to stop something that can go wrong, and then that information of why it wasn't, we knew about it, why didn't anything, anybody stop it or
Yeah,
listen?
yeah,
Yeah, so
it's frustrating.
yeah. Um, in terms of the remote viewing, how do you think, why do you think people become interested in this type of work specifically? Is there a certain type of person?
No, I don't think so. I've had all ages, races. I've trained people from around the world, all ages. I usually ask if they're coming to class that they be 80 over 18. I did have one younger gentleman at 17, but he came into class with his mother. So I felt that that was sort of a safeguard. But I haven't got into teaching children. There are a couple of remote viewers that do train younger people, but I like to train adults because they're established in the world, and um, it's a new skill that I can teach them.
Yeah,
And I haven't been teaching any weekend or application classes yet this year because I was asked by IRVA, the International Remote Viewing Association, to do some online classes. And of course, everything has gone online now since COVID.
right,
Um, so I have been doing a year-long series of classes for IRVA, and you can go to irva.org and you can find it all there under IRVA Ed. And each month the middle of the month, I give a 3-hour online class. It's an intro to class. So, for example, the last one I did in May was intro to out of body experiences. And then, as well as the class, which has exercises, PowerPoints, discussion, the students are able to share their experiences, etc. I also put a whole bunch of text, additional text onto IRVA, as well as the text of the PowerPoints
right.
for the students to get more information. So each month is a different topic. And in fact, the next one I'm doing this month is a little different. It's an intro to XORV, or anomalous communication, because it's diverting a little bit from the usual, cut-dried remote viewing.
Right.
But as you know, I wrote the book with Scott Jones, who sadly has since passed away. I know he'd be sad to hear that.
Yeah.
Um,
I was going to ask you about that.
yeah, yeah, the book is still out there. It's called Voices from the Cosmos, and it stemmed from a client. I had a 9-year business client who had a lot of very personal interests, and he said one time, and it was around 96. He said, can you use remote viewing to remote view ETs, UFOs, etc.? And I said, yeah, you can basically use it for anything. And the problem is feedback. How do you get feedback to know that you're correct? He said, well, that's okay. He said, because I want us to take a year off from business remote viewing, because I worked for him for 9 years and we did a whole bunch of stuff. And I've written Tactical Remote Viewing, gives you some of the story there. And so he said, let's one by one, let's look at different ET groups. And here's a set of questions I want you to ask. And we also looked up an indigenous questionnaire that somebody would take out, say, into the Amazon to a group that possibly had a little bit of contact with what we call as civilization, to ask, them non-leading questions. So we put together some questionnaires. And so over the whole year, interviewed over 20 different races, ET races. Now, it's very controversial, very, very controversial. because how do you get feedback? You don't get feedback. I just got questions and answers. And this was not channeling. This was not me making stuff up. I had the questions on my computer, sat in front of the computer and said, okay, is there a large gray out there that would answer some questions? Feeling very foolish for the first one. Like, what am I doing? How, you know, and I started getting in some information. So I just typed in to the computer whatever I was perceiving. Now, someone might say, well, were you picking this up from somebody in their mother's basement that was picking this up? And I said no, because every single group that I interviewed, and interview in quotes, was completely different, complete personality differences, response differences. Some wanted to talk to me, some didn't. The Reptilians, because that was one of the groups that we geared towards, they didn't particularly want to talk to me, and they often gave a lot of non-responses. And I would not want to meet them in the dark alley in the night. You know, for example, one question I asked was, if you met humans on board a craft, how would you react? And they said, well, we would make a loud noise at them. And I said, what if the loud noise doesn't move the human? They said, well, we would push them. Wow. So, yeah, gives you the shivers. Yeah. So each one was completely different in its in their responses, each group.
Let me just stop you there for 1 second. In terms of channeling information, maybe you can just clarify the difference between channeling a spirit or a guide giving you information and the information that you received. How would you label that? What would you point
Yeah,
as?
I am
Imagery?
I'm not a medium. I'm not a channeler. I haven't trained in those fields, but I am an OBE and I am a remote viewer. So I use those skills to access information, and it's accessing it via your subconscious. I don't allow spirits or any other entities to take over my body or my mind. I'm sovereign. This is me. I don't want any other outside influence, influence coming through me and influencing me. So I was acting purely as a reporter, accessing the information as if I had one of these groups sitting in front of me, giving me answers to the questions we were asking. It was very controlled.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, on the note of reptilians, it's interesting because I'm in communications with a shaman from Ecuador who's in his mid 80s. He expresses the experiences he's had of being taken on a ship and being told that much of the political disarray and conflict that exists presently is a reptilian spiritual, different races.
That's interesting.
Vying for control over the earth.
Yeah.
And so when he was walking through the forests up to the mountain to meditate, he would say, they'd ask him, did you see the good ones today or did you see the bad ones? And as you speak on the subject of making contact, it's so fascinating to have deciphered this information into something that's tangible in terms of visual.
And this isn't something that I do normally. This was done as a project for this particular client. I did a little more for him after the book, and we stopped actually after the year because the client came under surveillance. People were there was somebody taking his picture out in public, him and his wife, video filming him, going through his mail, coming to the cul-de-sac where he was living. When he came out, the car would screech off, and he got pretty scared at that because he hadn't experienced that before.
It's interesting because there are people. There's a man by the name of Christopher Bledsoe. I don't know if you're familiar.
I've heard the name. Yeah.
Okay, so he works in tandem with the government. They get information from his contacts from different alien races, And
Yeah.
so it's funny in terms of who they want to have the information and who they don't want the information in the hands of someone.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
I
interesting.
know. And because I didn't receive any harassment or anything for my role in it, but the client did. He was a businessman, a New York businessman, not anybody that any common name or name that anyone would recognize. He's since passed away too.
Yeah.
And he got really scared, and he said, "Look, let's stop doing these ET interviews." Because we had more lined up. We were in the middle of the RAL, the race on Mars, when it happened. Then I did write up some of that in the book. And so we completely stopped. Let's get back to business remote viewing,
Yeah.
which we did. And we did a couple of other fun stuff, which is in the book.
I'd like to move on a little bit to your UFO experiences, just a little bit, and then we'll move over to the esoteric aspect. And just before we
Sure.
do that, I can only speak of asking these particular questions with the motivation of me having my own personal experiences over the last, I'd say, 2 years, which
Yeah.
was interesting myself. I was on the beach and a craft came by, maybe about 400 or 500 feet
Oh,
in midday, 1 o'clock in the afternoon here in New Jersey. I
yeah.
was sitting there with my girlfriend, and all of a sudden, something prompted me to look to the right. So I looked right up to the right, and I see a floating silver disc. And as soon as I caught eyes with it, it
Hmm.
gradually went on a 45-degree angle upward into the clouds.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
and then that winter, I was on the Jersey Turnpike in the middle of winter, and a blue flash, a ball, right over by the airport, by Newark Airport, but it couldn't have been a Roman candle. It was the middle of winter, and it exploded. A blue ball exploded right above my car.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So I was obviously interested in who was trying to either make contact or what that those those uh, those situations, what they meant. If somebody came over to you, what would you tell them? If a friend came over to you, how would you analyze something like that?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't analyze it.
Okay.
I would listen, first of all,
Okay.
and then try and direct them, because there are a lot of people out there that prey on uh,
Contact.
people with these experiences. And I would tell them some of my experiences, because as a child, I had a lot of unusual experiences that I just shoved under the carpet. Yeah, I didn't know what to make of them. I had no context for them. And it wasn't until I was at PEAR, actually, at Princeton, that I suddenly started learning about these experiences that people were having. And I thought, I've had some experiences like that. So I did write a book. It's out of print now. It was called Diary of an Abduction, where I was trying to understand my own early experiences. And I had some additional experiences when I was there at Princeton. Again, very unverifiable, you know. Um, but I think a lot of people have these experiences. And then I came to work for Robert Bigelow here in Las Vegas, and he had done a big study for the Roper Poll, the big Roper Poll. I don't know if you've heard of that.
No.
No, he and several colleagues had sent out questionnaires to a group that the Roper organization had provided. These weren't selected people, and the questions were related to unusual personal experiences. And it turns out there were a whole bunch of people who could have been classified as having had abduction experiences or contact experiences. And there was a subgroup of them, the influential Americans. These were people who sociologically could defined as influential in some way, had more experiences. They were higher intelligence, more influential in the world, better educated. And because the common theme is, well, people who have these experiences must be uneducated, they must be, they must be just fabricating all this, etc., etc. but the poll showed that wasn't the case at all.
Interesting, very interesting. And I
Yeah,
know, I know, speaking with you about your personal experiences in as you grew up, and I remember you telling me the sightings that you've had. And
yeah,
it's
yeah,
so interesting. Um, let's move a little bit on to the subject of shamanism,
yeah,
and
yeah.
let's talk a little bit about your experiences with it and how you came upon that.
Yeah, and that was a more recent development. Well, 2010, which is not that recent, but in terms of lifestyle, lifelong. Um, I think I've always been into the shamanic stuff because I love nature growing up in England. I knew all the names of the wildflowers and the trees and the animals, and we had countryside near us that I and my brother explored. I had my own little garden. And I loved the earth. I used to love digging my fingers into the earth, and the seasons, really enjoyed the seasons. And it wasn't though until 2010, and I was talking with some lady colleagues, and one said that she had just been out to California, to Esalen, to with Hank Wesselman and Jill Kuykendall of Vision Seekers. And she just loved it. And she said, I want to share my notes with you. So my friend Claire and I and Phyllis, who had been to the class, she shared her notes with us. And we were like, we want to do this. So the next class that came around, also at Esalen, the three of us went and did the class. And I was in my element. I loved it. And we did, not only was there teaching from Hank and Jill, but there we were doing a lot of journeying work and experiential work. I absolutely loved it. And I went then from those classes to some other classes by Vision Seekers up in Sonoma, and more advanced classes, and did those for quite a few years, going up once or twice a year for classes, learning. And each time I came away from the class, it was like, what else is there for me to learn? I think I know it now. I go to the next class, it's like, wow, there's all this new stuff.
With regards to the shamanic journeying and going to different realms, low world, middle world, upper world, uh,
Yeah.
as it pertains to receiving information, did you find that your background of having OBEs and having that esoteric background and what you experienced in the past, had it assisted you, or you were on the correct path of where you were supposed to be?
It was a diversion. I found it easy to travel, to journey
Yeah.
and visualize. I've always been a very good visualizer. So I could visualize a lot, retain it, come back and journal it. And so it wasn't really a reinvention of, it was really, this was just an enhancement of the shamanic work to what I'd already been doing with remote viewing and remote perception.
Yeah. Did you ever have the interest of doing ayahuasca journeys, or did you?
Not really, because I understood that this was my understanding that many people go to do ayahuasca and mushrooms, etc., because they want to learn how to get out of body, how to journey. I could already do it. So I really had no interest in or motivation to go and do ayahuasca, or perhaps just for the experience of it. But there wasn't a big pull to do that.
Right. It's interesting
Yeah.
because I interview many people, and while they have NDEs, they
Yeah.
also feel the replication of that experience through DMT and the ayahuasca experience.
Right. And I understand that. Yeah. That it can enable somebody who's not naturally able to do these things to
Right.
have that experience.
How would you describe your outer body experience? Because I know many people that I speak with experience it in a stressful time where they're under stress, and then the stress forces their soul to just be displaced for
Right.
like
Yeah.
like a schizophrenic act, move, a split, a fragment.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And I can explain that in a way that when I was at Manchester University, and I went to an evening group which was called Journeys Out of the Mind, out of the, and the outer limits of the mind. And there was a whole circle of people sat round, and the teacher started talking initially about out-of-body experiences. And he said, let's go around the room and see who's had an out-of-body experience. So I thought, oh, that's interesting, because I knew that I'd had many of these. And one person said, well, they'd had an operation, and during the operation, they had gone out of their body. They could actually hear what the surgeon was saying and reported back after the operations and got feedback that it was correct. Another one had been in an accident and had seen their own body lying in the road and then come back into the body. Someone else had taken, a drug. I forget what it was that they'd taken, but they'd gone out of body and gone on a journey. And it was coming around to my turn. And I thought, these people have had one or two experiences. I've had hundreds.
Wow.
And I was worried that if I was to tell them my experiences, would I devalue their experiences? Or would I somehow feel that I was overstepping? I thought, no, I'm going to be honest and tell them. And I said, well, I'm interested in all the experiences, but I've had many of these since childhood, back to when I could first remember them, which was about 7, 8 years old. And I used to go and sit up on the roof. I'd be put to bed and I was still awake. So I'd go, fly up and sit on the roof, and I'd fly around the neighborhood, go to my grandmother's house. Those were the very early ones. And I knew I wasn't dreaming because I was still awake. And then I'd come back to bed and I'd go, okay, now I'm going to go to sleep. And there was a young man in the group, Peter, who also had multiple OBEs. So I didn't feel that I was the only one there.
Right.
But you're right. Some people only had one or two in their lifetime through various ways. But
Yeah, I'm fascinated with that because when I'm interviewing people who have had near-death experiences, there was an accident, a trauma, or something that forced the soul out of the body
yeah,
for a
yeah.
moment. And how would you differentiate then the OBE that you have that wasn't stress-induced? It seemed like you were able to control the OBE. Yes?
Yeah, there is a difference, and I've had both. The ones where I go out of body purposefully, I control. I know where I'm going. I have a journey, I have a destination usually, and I use it. It's now called extended remote viewing, ERV, different titles, but it's the same thing. I'll go and I'll wander around. I'll say, okay, remember this, remember this, remember this. Come back, write it down straight away. That's the purposeful one. But 2 years ago, I had a medical emergency where I blew my aorta, the big vessel that comes out of the heart, blew, just out of the blue.
Yeah.
And I had to have emergency open heart surgery. I'm fine now because they repaired it. But following that, while I was still under all it was in the post-op, where I was still under a lot of medications, etc., and just coming back, I was out of body, wandering around different rooms in the ER, in the operating room and the little side rooms, and I was observing the staff. But it's called delirium, post-operative delirium by the medical profession. And I honestly thought that I was just there. I didn't see myself. I didn't see my sick body lying there. But I was and the fact that I could go through walls and I didn't even classify it as out of body. It was just me traveling. And it wasn't till much later when I was finally in my body in a room going, why am I in this green room? But I remembered all those experiences. And so I've experienced both, the ones through trauma and the purposeful ones.
Is there a difference?
Yes, yeah. The trauma one, I had no memory of who I was or where I was, or no context. There was no context to it. There was no purpose to it. It was just wandering around observing and saying, oh, there's a guy in blue scrubs writing up a report. Okay, let's go in this room. Oh, they're having a meeting in here, you know. So that was the difference with the ones that I do purposefully. I usually have a purpose too. I know who I am. I know where I'm going.
Is there a different height at which you travel when you're in OB? Are you on ground level walking or flying or
With
higher?
the trauma one, I was in the air about person height, about head height, which was, I suppose, because we usually, that's how we usually see. And I was traveling around. But when I'm doing OBE or extended remote viewing, I can go aerially. Well, you can with controlled remote viewing too. You can choose to go aerially, you can go underground, you can go around things, inside structures, at will.
That's interesting. Maybe you create your own airline and take people
Yeah,
on,
yeah.
you call it OBE Airlines.
Yes.
Oh, that's it. I'm so fascinated with that. And so many of the people I interview always express their talk about their stories and hearing information. So, um, let's move on to the runes.
Right, yes,
Uh,
yeah.
I just want to, it's interesting. I came across, I was taking a class in London, the Alfred Finley Psychic School.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that.
Okay, it was doing a mediumship class, and
Yeah,
prior to the class itself, I was interested in putting together rune cards, and I kept
yeah,
being drawn to. My friend kept sending me Marvel comics of Thor. Interestingly, so
yeah.
it was like preloaded with something that I wasn't interested in. I started buying the Thor cards.
Oh, yes,
All of a
yeah.
sudden, I said, you know what? Maybe I'll make tarot cards with using Thor as the rune, the symbol on the
Uh-huh.
back of the card.
Yeah.
So 30 of us are in this workshop, and one person each person has to do connect to someone who's passed. So I connect to my grandmother. Hear my
Yeah.
grandmother see, it shows me a lightning bolt and shows me Thor. And
Interesting. Yeah.
they pick one person from the group to volunteer to do a reading for the group, the 30 people, a meeting,
Yeah.
and say, well, somebody comes through with Thor, with a hammer
Oh, wow.
and a lightning bolt. And so another woman
Yeah.
raises her hand. She says, "Oh, that's me. That's me. That's me." And I said, "Wow, it's so fascinating that it could be someone else, but it sounds so true for what I was doing."
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so which brings me to the subject of runes, which I've been using, and I know you teach a class or you've taught about runes itself.
I have, and I will be giving an intro to runes in November through IRVA,
Okay.
and then a whole bunch more information will be on the IRVA website. Um, I When I was back at Manchester University, which was where I discovered that other people could do OBE too, I also was getting a magazine called She, which is now long, long gone. It was a British women's magazine. And then it was an article about runes, RUNES. A lot of people call them ruins, and they're not ruins. These are stones or blocks of wood imprinted with glyphs or symbols, as you know. They each have a long, ancient history and meaning to them. And I found some of the Saxon runes first, because this article outlined some of the Saxon runes and gave a graphic. So I made my own. I bought some white clay and I made little stones and I imprinted them with a knife point, to do the glyph, and learned how to read them. Um, and then I was coming over to the States to live, and I was set to marry a Presbyterian minister that unfortunately didn't work out. And I thought, no, I can't take these over with me because he's going to think I'm very, very weird, which I'm weird anyway. And he found that out. So I didn't take them. I left them with a friend. I said, have these, enjoy them. But a long time after that, I came across Ralph Blum and his Germanic runes. You can buy those commercially. There's a book and there's a set of runes that you can buy, stones that are commercially made. I bought those and started practicing them with them. And I found I could be quite accurate with them because the runes can be used in as you know, in an interpretive way. Then I went to another group, another woman who was teaching Atwater, Phyllis Atwater, and she was teaching the goddess runes, and this was in New Jersey. And she said, just gather up a whole bunch of rocks from the ground, little rocks you can hold in your hands, bring them to class, and I'll teach you how to do the history and how to do the goddess runes. And you can actually find those still online. Go to Phyllis Atwater, PMH Atwater, and goddess runes, and you can find all that information. And so I learned the goddess runes. So now I had, several different options, but I kept coming back to the Ralph Blum stones because they seemed the most solid and reliable. Now those runes, he says, and he shows in his book how they went back through history right to the very earliest northern tribes of Europe, right, that used these not so much as a language, but just communication between people. For example, if they wanted a wound to heal, say a wound was in a cast, a leg was in a cast, they would put these healing runes on the cast itself, or they would put them over the lintel of the door for protection, and they would carve them into stones along the road for safety for travelers. So they had a very practical first application. Then they became a sort of language, an alphabet. And then they've come down over the centuries to us, where they're just now a curiosity to some, but to some of us, they're actually a work tool.
When you're working with the runes themselves, is there a specific protocol that you follow? Do you pick one, or do you pick
what I do
numerous?
Is when I'm doing a remote viewing and I get to a point where I want some more information, I will pull 3 runes. It's in a particular stage of the remote viewing, and I sometimes get a little off signal line, as we call it, and I go, okay, let me pull 3 runes, and those runes act then as a stimulus. The information that they contain, it's like, that's interesting, let me get back now into the session and incorporate that information, and it works. It gives me a little bit more information about the actual target that I'm looking for.
So if you were to pull 3 runes and they would have contradictory energies or contradictory messages in terms of, the different energies that the runes themselves have, is there one you take over the other, or you then?
Not particularly, because each of the runes has a specific meaning, but if you pull them reversed, they can have the opposite meaning.
Yeah.
So, but each one has its own very specific interpretation.
All right. As we proceed in closing the interview a little bit, I just wanted to ask you if there's any specific type of imagery or remote viewing you've done that you're able to share or not share. That's maybe upcoming information that what we could look forward to in these times.
I did one back in New Jersey in the 1980s. That was, I called the Exodus, which was a deterioration. We've been seeing it, a deterioration of the atmosphere in the northern hemispheres. And I think that is still, and I've written about it in the book, so you could probably find it still there. So I think that that's a possibility that could come about, where a lot of people migrate south because the atmosphere, the northern hemisphere atmosphere, becomes unbreathable, basically.
Wow.
And but I hope it doesn't happen. I really, I do these predictions, but it's like, oh, I hope that doesn't happen.
Is it to a cutoff point, or is it just in terms of the Northern Hemisphere regarding?
Mostly the Northern Hemisphere that it affected. Yeah.
Interesting. Is there some message you'd like to leave the audience regarding any of the things, the work you've done and the work you do in terms of life itself, or?
Keep an open mind. Don't become so bogged down in dogma and scientism, yeah. Because the church and the scientists and everybody tells us that none of this is real and it doesn't work. So just keep an open mind. You explore for yourself, and if it works for you, then work with it. Try not to be swayed by other people telling you that it's not real.
Thank you.
Okay.
If somebody would like to reach out to you in terms of your website and take some of your classes, where could they do that?
They can go to my website, which is mindwiseconsulting.com, www.mindwiseconsulting.com, or my email address, which is mindwiseconsulting@gmail.com, or go to IRVA.org, and then you can find and go to the IRVA Ed section. You'll find a lot of my work there.
Okay. I want to thank you, Angela, for joining me and sharing your time and the information.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.